Hi, I'm Chad with Move Forward Guitar. This lesson is from our course, Music Theory 2. All the lessons for this course are free on YouTube, so you can follow right along with the playlist or look in the description below for links to the rest of the lessons. To accelerate your learning though, I highly recommend you download the corresponding Music Theory 2 workbook and eGuide. To learn more about the workbook and eGuide, click the link on the screen or look in the description below. Welcome to Music Theory 2, Lesson 1. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you all the intervals on one string. So in the Music Theory 1 course, I touched on intervals, and I explained that an interval is just the distance between two notes. So for example, if we look at these notes on the fretboard, this would just be a G chromatic scale, but it's not important what the note names are. The distance between any two notes, so if I went from the first note to the second note, that's an interval distance. If I went from the first note to the third note, that's an interval distance, and so on. Or it could be between any of the notes. From here to here is an interval distance. It doesn't matter. It's just the distance between any two notes. Something else I talked about in Music Theory 1 were half steps and whole steps. And a half step, I told you, was an interval distance, and that's just from one note to the next note. So if you started on one note, went one fret up to the next note, that's a half step, also known as a semitone. Or a whole step is when you go from one note, doesn't matter what note it is, skip a fret and then go to the next note. That's a whole step or a whole tone. And if you remember in Music Theory 1, I talked about how scales are made up of intervals, chords are made up of intervals, and pretty much everything you do in music is made up of intervals, so it's really important to understand. But I didn't dive too deep in Music Theory 1 because that course was more of an overview of everything in music theory, just to give you a solid foundation to build on. In this lesson, we're really going to start diving into intervals and then continue to build on that because it's going to be really important for everything we do through the rest of these courses for understanding music theory. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about the interval names and the sounds that they create. So first, we're just going to start with the G chromatic scale, which is what's written on your screen. It doesn't matter that this is a G chromatic scale. That's just how it lands on the fretboard. This is a G note. And then if you remember from Music Theory 1, a chromatic scale is when you go from one note to an octave higher of the same note and then fill in all the rest of the notes in between. So you're to play half steps the whole way up. That's a chromatic scale. And since this is on the 3rd fret, 6th string, this is a G note, so this would be a G chromatic scale. But this would work no matter what note I was starting on, no matter what string. It just falls in a nice place in the neck, so that's where I drew it. So we're creating the first note as the tonic. So I've made that in red. If you remember in Music Theory 1, hopefully you remember what the tonic is. If you don't, you should go back and watch Music Theory 1 again, or at least watch that lesson, because it's really important for understanding scales, and scales are really important for understanding music theory. So definitely go back and watch that if you don't remember that. So this is our tonic, our lowest starting tonic note, and then up here is an octave higher, so that'd be a tonic 2, so that's in red as well. Like I said, this is a G chromatic scale, but it doesn't matter that this is a G note, because when we're talking about intervals and interval names, you don't have to worry about the note names. Interval names stay the same no matter what the note names are. It's just the distances that matter, the distances between the notes. So what I'm going to do right now is just go through every interval through an octave. And if you remember what an octave is, it's just starting at one note, going up 12 half steps. You'll hit the same note again, called an octave higher. Again, if you don't remember that from Music Theory 1, go back and watch that lesson. So I'm going to talk about the interval distance starting on this tonic and then between every note. So from this tonic to this note, the tonic to this note, and so on. I'm just going to go through every interval distance and give you the names, and then I'm also going to show them on the guitar as I'm going through these so you can actually hear them. So our first interval is called a minor second or a flat 2, and it's a half step apart because, like I said, a half step is your smallest interval. If you're going from one note to the next note on the same string, a fret up, that's a half step apart. The interval name is a minor second, or also known as a flat 2. Your next interval distance is a major second, so that's a whole step apart. So you know that a whole step is your next smallest difference after a half step. It's just two half steps put together, gives you a whole step. The name of that is a major second or just a 2. Our next interval, we're just going in half steps, so that would be a step and a half apart because we have our whole step and then another half step, so that's 1.5 steps. That's called a minor third or a flat 3. And this is a really important interval. The thirds are really important, so just remember that. You don't have to know why right now, just understand that the intervals of a minor third and then the next one that I'm going to show you, which is also a third, are really important to understand in music. Going up another half step is our next interval. That's 2 whole steps apart, and that gives us a major third or a 3. And like I said, like the minor third, the major third is a really important interval to understand, which we'll talk about a lot as we go through this course and later courses when we talk about chords. Major thirds and minor thirds are really important to understand, but don't worry too much about that for now. Just keep that in the back of your mind. So if I go from our tonic, go up 2 whole steps, that gives us a major third. Go up another half step, that's our next interval, which is 2.5 steps apart. That gives us a perfect fourth, or just a 4. And don't worry about why it's called perfect for right now. I'll touch on that later. That goes back to music history, and it's just the way music evolved over time, so it's really not even that important to understand why it's called perfect. But the fourth is called perfect, so it's a perfect fourth. Go up another half step. Now we're on to an interval that actually has 2 common names. And a lot of these intervals have more than one name. And the ones that are most important that have more than one name, I'm going to give you both of the names. And it really just depends on the musical situation as to what you would actually call it. But don't worry about that for now. We'll get into that later in the lessons, and it'll all make sense down the road. For now, just understand that intervals can have more than one name, and it just depends on the musical situation as to what you would call it. So the interval that is next is 3 whole steps apart, and that would either be called an augmented fourth or a sharp 4, or a diminished fifth or a flat 5, also known as a tritone, which is a really important interval to understand down the road. But for now, just know that this interval, starting on your tonic, going up 3 whole steps, can either be an augmented fourth, or called a sharp 4, or a diminished fifth, which is called a flat 5, or a tritone. Go up another half step, we're 3.5 steps apart. That gives us a perfect fifth. Again, you have that word perfect. Don't worry about why it's called perfect for now. Just realize that 3.5 steps apart is what's called a perfect fifth, or just a 5. Go up another half step. Now we are on another one that has 2 different names. Again, don't worry about which one to call it for now. Just realize that there's 2 common names that you can call this interval, and it depends on the musical situation, which we'll talk about in later lessons. And that's an augmented fifth, which is also known as a sharp 5, or a minor sixth, which is also known as a flat 6. And this is 4 whole steps apart. Go up another half step, we're at another one that has 2 different common names. The first one is a major sixth, or just a 6, or it could also be known as a diminished seventh, which is also called a double flat 7. And this is 4.5 steps apart. So the next interval is 5 whole steps apart, and that's a minor seventh or a flat 7. And that's, like I said, 5 whole steps apart. Then going up another half step, we're on a major seventh or a 7. This is 5.5 steps apart. And then we're on to our last interval that we're going to be talking about for this lesson, which is called a perfect octave. And we talked about octaves in the last course. Again, if you don't remember that, go back and watch it in the Music Theory 1 course, because octaves are really important to understand. It's when you start on one note and then you go up 12 half steps, you're on the same note but an octave higher, and I explain what that means in Music Theory 1. And that's 6 whole steps apart, which if broken down would be 12 half steps or 12 frets. And I just called them an octave in that course, but they're actually, when you're talking about interval names, proper interval names are called perfect octaves. But again, don't worry about where that perfect word came from when we're talking about intervals. It's really not important for what we're talking about. So it's a perfect octave, or just an octave, also known as an 8. So for a look at this chromatic scale again, a common way you would see this written on a fretboard would look like this, where it'd be your tonic. If we're talking about a scale, this would be your tonic. Then you'd have a flat 2, which is a minor second, a 2, which is a major second, a flat 3, which is a minor third, a 3, which is a major third, a 4, which is a perfect fourth, a sharp 4, which is an augmented fourth, a 5, which is your perfect fifth, a flat 6, which is your minor sixth, a 6, which is your major sixth, a flat 7, which is your minor 7, a 7, which is your major 7, and then the 8, which is another tonic, which is the perfect octave, so an octave higher than your starting note. And then you also have other common names, which would be right here. The sharp 4 or augmented fourth is also known as a flat 5 or diminished fifth, depending on the musical situation. The flat 6 or minor sixth is also known as a sharp 5 or augmented fifth, just again depending on the musical situation. And then the 6th, which is the most common way you'll hear it, but it's also known as a double flat 7. So the 6 is a major 6, but it's also known as a double flat 7, which is a diminished 7th. So if I wrote that out under here, you'd have your tonic, minor second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, augmented fourth or diminished fifth, perfect fifth, minor sixth or augmented fifth, major sixth or diminished seventh, minor seventh, major seventh, perfect octave. And that's what these are representing here. T for tonic, lowercase m for minor, uppercase M for major, P for perfect, A for augmented, and D for diminished. And the tonic is actually also known as a perfect 1, but don't worry about that for now. It's really not important. These are the ones you need to know for now. These are the most important that you come across the most, and will allow me to be able to talk about these intervals in the upcoming lessons and have them make sense. And don't worry about memorizing this for now. This is just giving you a reference. I just want you to see the names, hear the sounds of the intervals, understand that some of them have more than one name, and as we go through these lessons, I'm really going to explain what all of this means and why it's even important. And just quickly, the perfect intervals that you need to know for now are the 4th and the 5th, and the octave is really a perfect interval, but you can just call that an octave. All of the times that you see a flat symbol before a note are going to be minor, except right here on the 5th. When it's a flat 5, it's a diminished fifth. And again, we'll talk about why that is in later lessons, not important right now. I'm just giving you some quick tips for understanding this. So you can think of a minor interval when you're taking one interval like a second and lowering it down half a step. It goes from major to minor. See, it happens with the 2, it happens with the 3, and so on, except when it happens with the 5th, going down gives you a diminished fifth, not a minor fifth. There's no such thing as a minor fifth. And again, happens with the 6, happens with the 7. If you go down 1 fret, you have a minor 7th from a major 7th. But if you go down 2 frets, you have a diminished 7th. So that's the other time that diminished comes into play. It's on the 5th or the 7th. Those are the only ones you need to worry about for now. And then you can think of augmented as taking the perfect intervals, the 4th and the 5th, and raising those up 1 half step. That gives you augmented. So just think about it as augmented reality. So you're enhancing it. So you're raising it. So a perfect interval going up 1 half step gives you an augmented interval. And augmented means to sharp it, to raise it. And don't really think you have to memorize this for now. I'm going to keep coming back to this. I'm just giving you some quick tips now so that it's at least in the back of your mind as we're going through these lessons. So this probably seems like a lot of information, but don't worry about that for now. This is just giving you a foundation. I'll keep coming back to this, keep reiterating it. You have all the charts in your eGuide to go over, to use as a reference as we're going through these lessons. It's just important to touch on it now And then, like I said, as I'm going through these lessons, I'm really going to dive into what this all means. So that's an explanation of intervals on one string. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you the intervals between the strings. Look in your Music Theory 2 workbook for step-by-step guidance on how to retain this information and what to do next. And remember, all the charts and diagrams for this lesson are in your Music Theory 2 eGuide for you to reference at any time.